This morning, I'm asking the question, is America a free country? For years, the July 4th holiday has contended with my increasing disillusionment around this question. You may recall that in July of 2020, I delivered an impassioned sermon from my dining room table in which I lamented the sorry state of our individual and collective rights in that particular historical moment. This might have been one of the first times, if not the first time, that I quoted Audre Lorde and her line, "We aren't all free until we all get free," which has become a common refrain in my preaching. In fact, earlier this week, my partner asked me what the topic of my sermon was. And I said, oh, well, it's called Is America a Free Country? And they said, well, what are you going to say? And I sort of stumbled through the early conception of what I was thinking about. And they said to me, you're going to say, we aren't all free until we all get free. And I laughed because, of course, I was going to say just that. And maybe that's all I could say, and we could go to coffee hour. But I'll unpack it a little more. And so I'm going to remind you again at the beginning of this message that our liberation is bound up in our collective liberation, and that the fight for justice requires all of us to refuse to tolerate injustice anywhere. And we must recognize that we begin to lose our freedoms when we witness those who are more vulnerable than we lose their freedoms and do nothing. So, of course, this is where I am inevitably going, but I'm also thinking more deeply today about what we as Americans in this delicious multicultural melting pot are conditioned to believe freedom is. We must begin by defining freedom within our own cultural context. Here's something else I talk about quite a bit. American culture stresses individualism and individual autonomy and a sense of personal liberty. And that causes us to individualize our conception of freedom. This varies wildly from cultures in which interdependence is emphasized. In 2017, the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology conducted a study suggesting certain cultures are organized around the idea of personal choice, while others emphasize group harmony. Examining the responses of Westerners in contrast with responses from East Asians, cultures which emphasize collective rights over the rights of the individual, the study determined that East Asians tended to experience more reactance when their collective compared to their individual freedom was threatened, whereas Westerners experienced more reactance when their individual instead of their collective freedom was threatened. So, nestling our understanding of freedom within our cultural context, we are working from a definition in which freedom concerns our sense of individual control over our own lives. Speaking from my own individual locus, I personally have felt the squeeze around my own rights and freedoms growing tighter, seemingly these days, by the day. When the Supreme Court felled Roe, I lost a guarantee of the right over my own body. And on Tuesday, we're likely to see that autonomy further compromised. In a recent Supreme Court decision, I witnessed legalized discrimination of a community I myself am a part of, packaged as the assertion of others' religious freedom. And as Dennis reminded us today, this is a wider picture of legalized discrimination that begins with the felling of a previously protected class, a previously protected group of people, but of course that that will extend to everybody. This is always a slippery slope. Over and over again, I have listened to anecdotes surrounding the right to abortion and the right to participate in the marketplace without concern of discrimination, beginning with a chilling phrase, "I didn't think this would impact me." NPR has conducted a series of interviews with women who are directly impacted by abortion restrictions within their states, like Texas, Ohio, and Mississippi. And these people experience unviable pregnancies that lead to life-threatening complications, and they are denied treatment, which results in a loss of future fertility, among other devastating consequences. Considering the trauma of the events itself will have lifelong impacts on these people. And nearly every story published by NPR begins with the woman being interviewed explaining that when abortion was severely restricted in their own states, they were unconcerned because they didn't think that that would ever have anything to do with them. They think, well, I would never want an abortion. So if abortion is restricted in my own state, what does that really matter? It doesn't affect me. And then they experience pregnancy complications and they come to understand that abortion does not just mean the termination of an unwanted pregnancy. It means lots of things in the medical sphere, and you won't be able to access those things if the legislature has restricted your right to access these things. It's tremendously concerning to me that our individualized American consciousness soothes us into a false sense of security when we witness those around us begin to lose their rights. For white, relatively wealthy women to assume that legislation that primarily impacts other people, and of course these other people are poor folks and people of color, that it will never impact these women with all of their protective privilege. Therefore, it's not theirs to be concerned about. That's not only ignorant and shameful, it's downright dangerous. And this is what I mean when I quote Audre Lorde. When one group of us is threatened, all of our rights are threatened. The same thread can be connected in the fear-mongering, hateful legislation targeting transgender kids and adults all over this country. It is a dangerous fallacy to assume that these kinds of legalized discrimination will stop at the currently targeted group. It only begins with the most vulnerable among us, like transgender children, and it's only the beginning. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, Martin Luther King Jr., but it is only the beginning. And yet the most privileged amongst us are continuously lulled into a false sense of security. Surely we think they will never come for me until they someday do. On January 6th, 1941, in his State of the Union address, and yes, the eeriness of the January date is not lost on me, President Franklin D. Roosevelt revealed his 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. I can quickly identify the violation of at least 2 of these freedoms in our present day. Freedom from want concerns our confidence that we will be able to achieve a comfortable and sustainable quality of living with the resources at our disposal. But with the ever-rising cost of rent and basic essentials, more and more of us are unfamiliar with the freedom from want. According to a 2020 study, every $100 increase in the median rent is associated with a 9% increase in the estimated homelessness rate. For so long, many of us have enjoyed a relative sense of security from imminent homelessness. We've been able, when we pass unhoused folks on the street, to see them as very different from us. We make these assumptions that they've made choices that have led them to the streets, when the current reality is that we understand that homelessness is a housing problem. It's not necessarily only an addiction issue or an irresponsibility problem on behalf of the unhoused. When the cost of housing outpaces stagnant wages and families find their budgets stressed beyond capacity by out of control costs, these folks begin to experience rapid increases in homelessness. In 1941, freedom from want was attainable. Today, in the throes of late stage capitalism, we and many of our neighbors do not enjoy this once compulsory freedom. On the morning of Independence Day, NPR ran a 2-minute commentary explaining that the fear of becoming involved in a mass shooting event diminished our sense of freedom. None of us are free from fear in an era when tactical weapons are sold like trinkets at flea markets. Skylar was talking to me about this the other day, explaining that years ago, 10, 15 years ago, if you went to a gun show, the majority of the guns that would be on display would be for hunting and a few for home protection, handguns for home protection. And tactical weapons, like militarized weapons, would be sort of in the back of a gun show behind some kind of curtain. You probably needed some sort of special clearance to get into that part of the gun show. But today, if you buy a ticket to a gun show, the majority of the guns on display and freely for sale will be tactical militarized weapons, like your AK-47s, weapons that no person needs, but that is the majority of gun culture today. One journalist asked another to clarify how gun violence threatened our freedom, and he responded pretty matter-of-factly, "We're afraid, and our fear is justified, and fear compromises our freedom." Fear is the great incapacitator. Fear, in the short term, short circuits our brains, rendering us helpless to our primal responses of fight, flight, or fawn. Fear that is persistent and ever present incapacitates us in the long term. It impacts our mental health and hormonal and endocrine systems. Living in fear literally makes us sick. I have a little story about short-term fear. In 2014, I graduated from divinity school, and to celebrate, my mother and I embarked on a 6-day hike of the Grand Canyon. We went with a group and we hiked the 14 miles into the Havasupai territory of Havasu Falls, which is a region of the Grand Canyon. You've probably seen pictures of the bright blue waterfalls. Once we were there, we spent 3 or 4 days embarking on day hikes to waterfalls and wading pools that were this bright turquoise color I'd really only ever seen in Disney movies up until that point. And on the second day, we hiked to Mooney Falls, which is a giant, pristine waterfall that requires hikers to scale down a 70-foot chain and rope ladder. There was a groan in the sanctuary. Yeah, it was creepy. I recall our hiking mates making fun of my mom and I because we had brought along those tacky gardening gloves to help us grip these slippery chains, because the chains that the 70-foot ladder is made out of get sprayed by this massive waterfall. So they get really slippery. So we brought along these gardening gloves, and people were teasing us, but we didn't care because we already were feeling superior with our thoughtfulness. So we stood in this long line waiting to climb down this rope ladder, and there was this sort of like carved out rock that you had to kind of crawl through. It was like sort of cave, like you had to crawl through, and then you came out on this little ledge, and right there was this chain ladder that you were just supposed to begin climbing down. And I remember waiting in this line, and it was full of like very giddy, nervous energy. And of course, a lot of the people that go to the Havasu territory, they're athletes, they're very strong. We were not in that class. So I remember my mom and I reminding each other, take your time when you get to the ladder. Don't allow the perceived impatience of others to cause us to rush in a way that would endanger us. So I started my descent first, and my mom was up above me. And I have this really clear memory as I started to scale down this ladder. I glanced down at the ground, right? First mistake. I glanced down at the ground, and I just had this full body. It's like your stomach drops out of your feet, this full body whoosh of fear. And I was stuck. I was stuck on this ladder. And I looked up, and my mom's feet, were like 2 or 3 feet above my head. And I took this deep breath, and I hollered up to my mom, "Mom, do not allow yourself to become paralyzed by fear." And I crawled down the rest of the ladder, and she crawled down after me. And we got to the bottom, and we were laughing, and we were exhilarated. And my mom tells me to this day that me saying, "Do not allow yourself to become paralyzed by fear," runs through her head when she's like, got to have a hard conversation, or there's like a spider she's got to evacuate from her house. So that's a story about contained fear in a moment, but unrelenting, constant fear is another matter entirely. We are besieged by fear in this country, from the threat of very real gun violence to the fears that are invented with the aim to distract us, like fear of transgender people or immigrants or liberal educated progressives. Fear is weaponized in America to anesthetize us, to distract us, and to keep us fighting each other instead of fighting the system. Consider the weaponization of fear to intimidate those working for justice in the whole history of this country. Think about the Civil Rights March from Selma to Montgomery in 1965, in which one of the saints of our religion, Unitarian Universalist minister James Reeb, was beaten to death by a group of white supremacist men, to the modern day persecution of those participating in the Black Lives Matter movement, with the US federal government using surveillance and the criminalization of protests and the use of the criminal legal system to prevent people from protesting and punishing them when they dare to march. We are inundated by fears every day, both real and trumped up. The more we are controlled by our fears, the less we are free. The first step in getting a hold of our collective fear is becoming conscious of it. There is a reason NPR is distributing think pieces articulating a sense of a loss of freedom with the ever-present fear of becoming a victim of a mass shooting. I think that years of applied pressure and fatigue and frustration and rage of the American people is reaching a breaking point, a place where our grief and our rage splits wide open and demands healing and repair. This is how we reclaim a sense of control, transitioning from fear to action to a reclamation of freedom requires us to dissolve the barriers between one another. We must become reacquainted with our shared inherent worth. Any injustice enacted on a citizen of this country is an injustice and a threat to us all. We must learn to balance our individualized conception of freedom of consciousness with our sense of communal interdependence. And years ago, when I first came to Unitarian Universalism, this idea of interdependence and community was so attractive to me because it was something that was missing from the rest of the cultural zeitgeist. Is America a free country? Not according to my vantage point, nor when considering the whole picture. Can America become the free country we desire for ourselves and our fellow citizens? Certainly, if we get serious about the work of co-creation. We have empowerment to reclaim if we recognize justice as a collective effort, if we refuse to be incapacitated by our fear, if we value the freedoms of our neighbors as much as we value our own. Yes, we can all get free. We can all get free. We can all get free. May it be so because we make it so. Amen and blessed be.